Hello, I am Safexic, and I'm going to be talking about how much RAM you need in 2026. I'm going to be going over the basics. I'm also going to give a little bit of a history lesson as well, and let's just get straight into it. So first of all, RAM is expensive, okay? So before it wasn't as expensive, but then the AI crisis came and everything's all expensive now. So things have changed quite a bit. So before, everyone would recommend 32 gigabytes of RAM because, well, it was very close to 16 gigs. So 32 gigs and 16 gigs were very, very close in price range, and because of that, everyone went for 32 gigs. Not only that, but RAM now is dead expensive, and the opinions have changed because some people back then would never consider 8 gigabytes of RAM. Nowadays, people would definitely get the 8 gigs of RAM because, well, RAM is still expensive as fuck. I mean, heck, 32 gigs of RAM is costing as much as a GPU, so yeah, let's get into what I've learned. 8 gigs of RAM. When it comes to 8 gigs of RAM, it's good for some particular types of games, okay? More specifically, the retro type of games, so games like Quake 2, Quake 1, Singularity, the older Oblivion, and it would also be good for 2D games such as Terraria and NSS. And the reason why I'm saying this is because these types of games don't really require as much RAM because of, well, A, how old they are, so they're going to become very optimized for current and newer PCs. And even then, like, budget PCs now would be able to run older games really easily, especially games like the original Modern Warfare, or maybe if you want to try out Terraria, which by the way is an amazing 2D game. But what makes 8 gigabytes of RAM just good for these types of games is the fact that it just doesn't really take that much processing power to begin with. So yeah, that's just the basics of that. There's not really much to say when it comes to this. So yeah, anyways, let's get on to my next point, which is 16 gigs of RAM. 16 gigs of RAM. 16 gigabytes of RAM is good for average gaming, such as Counter-Strike 2, Fortnite, Oblivion, the newer one, because that is the minimum requirement, and so much more. 16 gigabytes of RAM is what a lot of people are averaging at the moment. So they are mostly going for about 16 gigs of RAM, and they're looking for 32 gigabytes of RAM in the future. Not only that, but 16 gigs of RAM is just really good in general, because it's not only affordable, well, somewhat affordable, but also a lot of people within the budget mid-range build, so anywhere between $500 to $1K, should mostly be focusing towards 16 gigs of RAM. And the main reason why is because if you focus on 32 gigs of RAM, you're already eating up at half your budget. And 32 gigs of RAM now costs like over $300, whereas 16 gigs of RAM now costs anywhere between the $200 range, which still is pretty crappy, but it's not too bad, as last year literally was $300 for 16 gigs, which was horrendous. So it is starting to see a very slow decrease, which is pretty good, but still. Now, one last thing I do want to mention is that when it comes to 16 gigs of RAM, you're not really going to be able to do much with 16 gigs. You're not going to be able to do high-performing video editing tasks. Well, yes, you can do video editing tasks, game developing tasks, and just high-end-ish tasks. You won't be able to do as much high-end tasks, such as editing 4K high-end videos, or making Unreal Engine good videos, and Unreal Engine games. You can't really be doing that with 16 gigs of RAM. That's for 32 gigabytes of RAM, which I'm actually going to get into right now. So, let's go to 32 gigs. 32 gigabytes of RAM. 32 gigabytes of RAM is good for everything. Recording, video editing, content creation, literally everything. 32 gigabytes of RAM is also the sweet spot, and what I'd like to say, the cap, in my opinion, because after this you won't really be seeing much of an increase, mostly in gaming, in like video editing and content creation and all that. You will see a bit of a difference in increase, but me personally, I would highly recommend just people stick to 32 gigs of RAM if you're just not on a budget and you're willing to spend a lot of money. Now, 32 gigabytes of RAM is just really good overall because you're able to do everything. You're able to play the newer games, you're able to future-proof, and you're able to do so much more. Not only that, but a lot of people do use 32 gigs of RAM as well, but I personally wouldn't recommend 52 gigabytes of RAM if you're below a 1K budget, like I said. I recommend 32 gigs of RAM if you're anywhere between a 1K to 2K build, maybe even 3K, okay? The main reason why is because for gaming, it's perfect. Now, let's go to 64 gigs of RAM. 64 gigs of RAM is only good for, and I'm going to make this real quick as well, 64 gigabytes of RAM is only good for like high-end softwares such as video editing, game development, so like Unreal Engine, DaVinci Resolve, Premiere Pro, those types of tasks, okay? Gaming, you won't see an increase at all. If anything, you'll see a slight increase. Because of how expensive 32 gigs of RAM is and 64 gigs of RAM is, I would not recommend 64 in the slightest. If 32 gigabytes of RAM is extremely expensive, like 64 gigabytes of RAM, you're gonna need to take out a liver, a kidney, a heart, maybe some brains as well. So yeah. Now, let's go straight to the conclusion. So, here it is. Conclusion. With the conclusion, there is a few things that I'd like to say. If you're into the older games, go for 8 gigs of RAM, but me personally, I would highly recommend just 16 gigs of RAM, and even now, I would just recommend for just any budget. And that's mostly because you can always just get rid of your new RAM and just upgrade further, because even though it's expensive now, it will be a lot cheaper in a year's time. And even though there's always something wrong with the PC industry, it's best to just cheap out at the moment and just get some average 16 gigs of RAM, and then when the time comes and it's cheaper, go for 32 gigs. That's what I would highly recommend. Anyways, other than that, if you enjoyed today's video, please make sure to let me know what video ideas you want in my videos in the future. I have got a bunch of other channels as well, so I would highly recommend checking them out. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Without further ado, have a good day, and peace out.